very pleased to welcome back Professor Mateusz Grochowski, who is Associate Professor at Tulane University School of Law. Mateusz graduated from the LLM program at Yale Law School and is a longtime fellow of the ISB. Welcome back. Thank you for doing this.
Yes, so thank you. Thank you for the introduction. Thank you, above all, for hosting me again at ISB. I'm always very glad to be back in this community. And today, I would like to share with you a few thoughts about part of my work, which is a year-long project on algorithmic pricing. I've started many years ago with a few papers. Later on, the project evolved into an edited volume I published early this year at Cambridge University Press. And also, it turned out that the question of algorithmic pricing becomes more and more timely and more controversial, both in the US and in the other parts of the world. And many of those controversies started emerging pretty early. Some of them, however, are very recent. Some of them started to come into surface like in the past months or even past weeks. And let's start with something that you probably heard about, or you likely at least came across some bits and pieces of this story. So in the summer, Delta Airlines announced that they are not going to price clients for the airline tickets on a flat rate, but they are going to use algorithms in order to evaluate how particular consumers are in need of the particular travel, and to what extent particular consumers may be interested in paying the particular price, which is probably one of the most explicit, one of the most conspicuous examples for how algorithmic pricing works. And Delta Airlines is, of course, just the tip of the iceberg, because algorithmic pricing in many forms has been applied for years, if not decades, in various parts of the industry. The first attempts, for example, on consumer retail platforms, such as Amazon, date back to like around 2004, 2005. Later on, we had a whole bunch of examples from various parts of the digital industry of platforms applying algorithms in order to analyze consumer data, in order to establish prices, or at least establish some more like granular prices for consumer groups, sometimes for individual identifiable consumers. And the whole story about price personalization can be somehow brought down to three main points. So what is specific about price personalization as opposed to the other non-personalization-based, non-algorithmic-based pricing schemes? So first of all, this is the price differentiation. This is not something that you would be probably surprised with. And in a moment, I will try to explain why this element of algorithmic pricing is not necessarily very shocking or very new. That's like the core part of the algorithmic pricing scheme, is that consumers are charged different prices depending on who they are and depending on how they are perceived by the algorithm. Secondly, there's of course surveillance. So the question of data, the question of information that particular firm can gather about particular clients or particular groups of clients. And thirdly, this is of course automation. So algorithmic pricing is not done by individual, agents of the firm, by individual employees. It's done by the machine. It's done by algorithms. It's carried out by the automated processes that sometimes happen within like splits of seconds, sometimes are much faster than any human being would be able to reason, to process this amount of data. And as I told you before, algorithmic pricing is not new regarding its substance, it's new regarding its method. Why it's not new regarding its substance? Because for a long time in the consumer economy, we have been having many instances of prices that were not fixed, not flat for all consumers, and where prices were to some extent at least adjusted to particular consumer groups or to particular circumstances in which those consumers are making contracts. Think, for example, it's probably like the most trivial instance for that. When you take the Metro North train from New York City to New Haven, you can choose between peak and off-peak hours, and the price differs depending on when you take your ride. Yes, this is a very old and very, I would say, simplistic example, but it's still a very illustrative example for how consumer prices were differentiated, how consumer prices were not entirely flat in the pre-algorithmic era. And we have many instances like that. We have been having many instances like that for centuries. What is new for algorithmic pricing is what's happening in between those two ends of the spectrum. So what's happening in between the scenario in which we have like one consumer, one price, and in which we have a completely flat, completely unified price for all consumers. And what's happening there can be, for example, consumers negotiating prices and establishing an individual price for themselves, but so can be the firm that analyzes the data of consumers and applies the personalized individual pricing levels for each particular customer or for the groups of customers. When we think about what is happening in between in this orange box with the question mark, of course, we have the consumer data, we have the algorithms, and we have this very like robust epistemic computational power of firms that in the era of algorithms can somehow fulfill the old dream of being able to establish, or at least to get close to the price level that would be more or less representative for the individual willingness of each consumer to pay the particular price. So again, as I said before, algorithmic pricing is not new in terms of substance, it's new in terms of method. It's new in terms of how deeply firms can look into our preferences, into our behavior, into our characteristics, and what information, what conclusions they can infer from those like bits and pieces of facts about how individuals behave on the market. And when you look at the algorithmic pricing literature, both in law and in the other disciplines, most of this literature is focused on identifying some, broadly speaking, concerns about why algorithmic pricing is a problem, to what extent algorithmic pricing can pose particular idiosyncratic threats for consumers that were not present in the consumer market before. And the first group of those concerns relates to, broadly speaking, the market power and antitrust issues. So first of all, of course, algorithmic pricing functions to the highest extent in the settings in which one of the firms can gather enough of market power to be able to dictate prices to a considerably large group of consumers. We are not necessarily talking about the monopolistic market structure. It can be simply the market structure in which consumers just gather enough information about, in which firms gather enough information about consumers to be able to simply establish prices for the particular market sphere. Think, for example, about Amazon, think of Uber and other ride-sharing platforms, think of some hotel booking platforms, and so far and so on. The other thing that is also very frequently observed, and at least recently, we have a high interest in this. In this problem is the so-called algorithmic price collusion. So algorithms have a high propensity to collude over prices. The fact that one firm is using the algorithm that analyzes the market, analyzes consumer behavior, also analyzes the prices set by the competitors on the market, can very directly and very easily lead to algorithms colluding and creating some kind of like unified pricing schemes across the market and somehow killing the actual competition. But also, in many situations, firms are using the algorithmic pricing software that is provided by third parties. For example, for a long time, there has been a controversy over this on the housing market in the US, where many rental prices are calculated by the software that is provided by one third party that has the overview of the entire market and maybe cannot collude in the direct sense, but can effectively control the prices across the entire market by the use of this software. But what is also important, apart from those like market structure, market power, collusion questions, is the question of the individual consumers and to what extent algorithmic pricing is posing some threats, some concerns for the individual consumers. And of course, the first thing that comes to our minds is discrimination. In a moment, I will tell you why discrimination is not necessarily the best label for price personalization. But discrimination is clearly kind of like the instinctive, intuitive concern, question we are asking whenever we come across price personalization. So in our terms, why I should pay a different price than my neighbor, I should pay a different price, for example, for my Delta flight than anybody else in this room, and so far and so on. Secondly, of course, privacy. So the use of consumer data, individual data, in order to set prices. Again, in a moment, I will try to explain why I don't think it is the most accurate and the most relevant label. Then somehow in connection with discrimination and privacy, or like in the cross section of those two concepts, we have market vulnerabilities, because it's very easy to imagine a situation in which consumers who are, for example, in the particular need of the particular service or good, and where this need is premised on the particular weakness, particular vulnerability of this particular consumer or the group of consumers to which this consumer belongs, it's priced higher because the algorithm recognizes this person as being in a higher need and therefore being potentially capable or potentially willing to pay a higher price for the particular commodity. And finally, which like what follows from those three concepts is exploitation. So it's very easy to imagine a world in which algorithmic pricing may eventually lead to clustering consumers in a way that will exploit some consumers vis-a-vis the others, that will also exploit particular very intimate, sometimes very sensitive information about those consumers, about their behavioral patterns, about the way they behave on the market. And why I told you that discrimination or exploitation is not necessarily the best label, because when we think about algorithmic pricing, it's first of all not very clear why we should talk about price discrimination and what really price discrimination means, because there is no one set understanding of discrimination, of price discrimination across the board between economics, law, and social studies. Each of those disciplines has multiple concepts of price discrimination. And it's also very hard to pin down what is the benchmark for price discrimination. Because of course, we are completely okay with the situation where the prices on the market are not entirely flat. But also it's very hard to find a clear benchmark, a clear yardstick for measuring to what extent the particular price is still differentiated but okay, or is already discriminatory. Yes, so no clear benchmark. And secondly, there are some theories of algorithmic pricing or like pricing in general that try to, and those theories originate mostly in like law and economics or like economic studies in general, that are saying, okay, there is nothing economically wrong with algorithmic pricing, because what we are having is simply more like perfected amount of knowledge about individuals, about consumers on the market, about functioning of the market. And why should we bother about the fact that people are priced exactly in the price point where their reservation price, where the willingness to pay of those people is? So what is wrong about it? Yes. And also some people, let's say more like classically economically oriented analysis of those topics will tell you that, well, whenever we have a firm that prices consumers differently across the board, for example, think about ride-sharing apps, ride-sharing firms such as Uber, there is not necessarily something wrong about the fact that such firms are pricing particular consumers higher, because when they price particular consumers higher, they can also price the other consumers lower. Yes, they can cross-subsidize between consumers, and eventually consumers who otherwise would not have access to the particular good or service, for example, consumers who live in more like remote parts of the city, or who live in more like in the poorer parts of the particular neighborhood, may have access to the particular service because the other consumers, yes, who simply can afford this ride, can pay for them, can subsidize them. So discrimination exploitation is not necessarily the most precise, the most like functional label for understanding what might be wrong with price personalization. Secondly, privacy. And I told you privacy is, again, not necessarily the best label, because first of all, the vast majority of pricing schemes that use algorithmic pricing are not necessarily based on the direct harvesting of consumer data. Sometimes it's simply about the use of like the secondary data, derivative data, or the data has been purchased from the other companies, from the other entities on the market. Yes, so it's not necessarily about like the direct consumer consent, direct consumer control over that. Secondly, algorithmic pricing is not primarily about privacy, to the extent that firms are not interested in understanding, for example, what is my preference about, I don't know, how desperately I need this bottle of water. What they are interested in is what extent my need for this bottle of water locates me against the backdrop of the particular group of consumers, for example, the Yale School affiliates on the particular day of the week, for example. Yes, so it's more about building correlation rather than about privacy. So again, privacy, of course, is a part of this picture, but it does not give us a clear explanation why algorithmic pricing is a problem. And here on the slide, I put this cartoon for a particular reason, just to explain you how this privacy may or may not necessarily to the full extent operate as a label, because there are some allegations that particular companies, for example, ride-sharing companies such as Uber, are using information not only about our behavioral patterns, but also, for example, about our device that we use in order to call the ride. And sometimes the information, and this is one of the pieces of information that can be communicated to the external entity such as Uber, as the information about our battery life, yes? And there is some evidence. Of course, it's not fully convincing, but at least there is some possibility for that firms may use information about what is the remaining battery life, and can infer from the fact that, for example, we have a 5% or 2% of battery left or higher need to get the particular right in the particular moment, which means that the price for this right can be higher comparing to the situation in which our battery has, for example, 20% of life left, because it means that we have more time to, for example, wait for a better offer or to browse between various platforms and so far. But again, this information about our battery life is not necessarily precise in terms of understanding what is happening here, because it's always about like the relative willingness to pay for the particular consumer vis-a-vis the group of consumers who are, for example, calling the Uber ride in the particular neighborhood of New York. So this information can be sensitive, can be important, but it's not everything. It does not necessarily is the essence of how algorithmic pricing works. In order to understand what might be really wrong about algorithmic pricing and to what extent algorithmic pricing really brings something new and something questionable to the picture of consumer economy, of the digital consumer market as well that we used to have before, I would like to get to the central part of today's talk that was also underscored in the title, which is the concept of the digital persona. And the concept of digital persona is the concept that dates back to early 1990s, when people started thinking about human life as being somehow led into parallel universes. Yes, so as human life being a life of the real human person, the human life as being the representation of this life through the data that is available to the third parties on the digital market. And here on the slide, you can see a quote from one of the seminal pieces of scholarship that somehow put forward, coined the concept of the digital persona. And the digital persona is, of course, a very vague generic concept, but it's a concept that I think is a very interesting way of perceiving how consumers are perceived in the digital economy and to what extent consumers can be, I would say, to what extent the information about consumers can be used to create some kind of the consumer avatar, which later on may generate, in consequence, may generate some economic outcomes for this particular consumer. And the other part of the digital persona concept is, again, the same author, but this is just the beginning of a pretty robust scholarship on the digital persona in social sciences and economics. The part of the digital consumer concept is also the idea that consumers should have, or individuals in the digital economy should have some degree of control over how they are perceived by the third parties. In the same way as in our real life social interactions, we have control over how we are perceived, yes, through our outfit, through the way we talk, through the topics we, for example, choose to talk about with our friends, colleagues, family members, yes, through many other ways of building our social interpersonal image. In the same way, or in a similar way, this right should be also guaranteed for the individuals in the digital economy. The second part of the story is going slightly back in time as the early 1970s, late 1960s, intellectual history of thinking about the consumer economy as the economy of representations. And on this slide and the next slide, I would like to show you just two quite representative works of the French sociologists of that era, and remember, it's like 1960s, 1970s, so it's like the peak of the classical mass consumption society, where people start perceiving consumers as not just individuals who buy a washing machine or who buy a cereal in the morning, but who somehow create themselves as social members through the consumption and who function in the economy, on the market, again, as I said before, as some kind of like curated avatars created through particular consumer choices, but also created through the way how we behave on the market, what information we reveal about ourselves. For example, when we go to buy carrots in the morning, is what the seller of those carrots knows about us and what price we can get because of how the seller of those carrots can evaluate our wealth, our willingness to pay, our interest in this particular bunch of carrots. So in other terms, this concept of consumption as representation, as perceiving consumers as not only market actors, but also actors in the particular communication process. So as actors who are not only buying particular commodities, but who are also creating some kind of image of themselves, and for whom this image is both a part of their identity, but for whom this image can also entail some economic consequences. So the fact that we engage ourselves in the particular type of consumption means also that we, for example, get particular prices, we get particular discounts, we get particular offers, and so far. So that was Jean Baudrillard. And the second, I think, very, very important work for this like intellectual stream as Guy Debord, so another French sociologist who basically was saying the same as you could see on the previous slide. So who was claiming that our market life, our social life as consumers in the mass consumption society is a series of representations that are also co-created, co-curated by us as consumers. And how this all relates to the fact that we are having the surveillance algorithmic pricing. So first of all, algorithmic pricing to a great extent subverts the classical concept of the consumer economy, in which consumers have certain degree of control over the market representations they create about themselves, and the control over the digital personas, the digital avatars they can establish in the, let's say, digital market, digital society interactions. Secondly, this subversion is targeting the particular foundational part of this work, of this picture. So it's targeting the control of individuals, how they are perceived in the market interactions by the firms, by those who want to sell them particular commodities. And in the classical world, of course, there's like neutrality of consumer avatars was not entire, but in the algorithmic pricing world, firms are getting more and more capability of getting like very deeply into our behavioral patterns, into our psychology, into our preferences that we are not always very happy about revealing to anybody else, in particular to those who can, for example, establish particular prices for us, building on who we are and building on what are our individual preferences, our individual proclivities, and so far. And in this way, algorithmic pricing deconstructs the concept of the digital persona, deconstructs the concept of consumption as a way of like functioning in the social market interactions with some degree of control over who we are, how we are perceived, and to what extent the economic status of us depends on the information we want or we don't want to reveal to the others. Of course, this concept, and again, we are talking today a lot about the like intellectual history of privacy, of consumer economy. So this is one of the like very classical quote about privacy as control. I think in this room, I don't need to explain too much about what privacy as control means. But of course, this concept of digital avatars, of digital persona relates quite closely to privacy as control, but it relates in a very particular way. So it's not about controlling particular information. It's not about giving consent or not giving consent to the reveal of particular data about ourselves, but primarily about providing individuals with the control over the way they are perceived as actors in the particular market interactions. Remember what I said before, that in the algorithmic pricing, we are not necessarily evaluated upon how much of the battery life is left for us in our smartphone. We're evaluated, we are priced depending on how this information about ourselves bundled with all the other details about ourselves that the firm can gather, allocates us against the background of the particular consumer group. For example, consumers who are ordering a flight or ordering a Uber ride on the particular route in the particular neighborhood on the particular day. And what follows from this is that I think many of our ways of thinking about how to regulate algorithmic pricing, price personalization are not necessarily well suited for the actual problem of price personalization. Here on the slide, you can see a very recent example of legislation. It's from it's a few months old piece of regulation from New York about algorithmic pricing. Is the first example of regulation of algorithmic pricing in the US, where in the state of New York, whenever consumers are getting a personalized price, they must be informed. There must be exactly this formula. The price was set by an algorithm using your personal data. We have a very similar concept in a very similar regulatory tool in the European Union. Exactly the same or like almost the same formula through which consumers must be informed about the fact that the price was personalized by them. What is wrong about those attempts to regulate prices? Of course, they are based on a very simple disclosure. This disclosure is quite ostensible because this disclosure does not inform consumers about anything except for the fact that the price was potentially differentiated based on the personal data of these consumers, but it does not give consumers any information about how this price was differs from the prices of the other consumer paid by the other consumers on the market. What particular details were used to differentiate this price, and so far and so on. Secondly, this regulatory method does not really give consumers any choice. Yes, it may, of course, provide consumers with some information that the price may be different. It may appeal to those consumers who have some apprehension towards being personalized. But do we really assume that consumers who, for example, take Uber rides will all of a sudden stop taking Uber rides because they know the price was personalized? Probably not. So it may have some kind of like behavioral psychological effect on the market, but not necessarily will protect anybody from anything in a meaningful way. And thirdly, This instrument builds on, I think, a pretty unrealistic, pretty like idealistic assumption about how consumers are capable to act and to what extent consumers want to act to protect themselves on the market. So I think it builds on the assumption that consumers may be interested in getting particular information about the fact that the price is not flat, that the price was set only for them, building on the personal data of those consumers. But at the same time, it somehow assumes that consumers will proactively seek more information. Will, for example, compare the offer they got from one airline with the offer of the other airline, or they will compare two prices for two different rides on two different apps, and so far and so on. So again, a very high and pretty unrealistic expectation about what consumers may want and to what extent consumers may be interested in protecting themselves in this regard. And what can I say as a bottom line? I think it's possible, thinking about personalized pricing through the concept of or through the lens of the concept of digital persona, to think about three main building blocks that should be present in order to provide consumers with the meaningful protection in this particular market context. So first of all, consumers must have information about how the particular price that they are offered refers to some benchmark, to some reference price. It can be different types of benchmarks, yes? It can be the average market price, which of course is very controversial. It may be very hard to be established, but it can be also, for example, the average price for the, I don't know, Uber ride on the particular route for the last 2 or 3 weeks. Yes, so some kind of information about how this price that was personalized differs from the price that was paid by the other consumers, from some kind of average benchmark that applies to this particular commodity. Secondly, apart from the pure information about the fact that the price was personalized, consumers should get at least the basic algorithmic transparency. So at least the basic information about what are the premises, what are the correlations, at least again at the very basic, to the very core extent, about information, about data that was used in order to calculate the price. And thirdly, which somehow speaks back to this classical concept of privacy as control, those consumers who want to behave more proactively should have the right to opt out, either in the wholesale way, so for example, to switch between personalized and non-personal price, or should be able to opt out from having the price personalized on particular parts of the personal data that the firm may have about it. And finally, I also think that there should be bans on personalization for the particular goods, for the sake of what we were talking about before. So for the sake of the fact that particular goods may be especially relevant for the, let's say, for satisfying some basic needs of consumers, or that they may be also particularly linked, particularly sensitive to market vulnerabilities and to the fact that certain consumers may be simply easily exploited by algorithms that operate on a simple willingness to pay reservation price based model. I think building on those 3 blocks, coupled with this general prohibition, we can think in a more structured, in a more wholesome way about protecting consumers, not only in terms of price discrimination, not only in terms of privacy, but also in terms of consumers as market actors who should have the right to protect themselves in terms of the market image, in terms of the digital persona they want to create and maintain about themselves in the consumer-firm interaction in the digital economy. Thank you so much. I'm very happy to hear your comments, questions. doubts. Thank you. Yes.
Thanks so much. It's great. I love the dive into the pretty critical sociology. Appreciate it a lot. So what I was thinking about with regard to this as a potential, proposal is maybe like a sort of second order consequence of this that would be hopefully in favor of consumers, and that's like the question of legitimacy, right?
Mhm.
So with these kinds of transparency reveals, there might be, you might not have consumers that are all individually empowered to take action on their own behalf. But there maybe is that kind of ick factor, right? That might lead a person away from one kind of product or another. So given that, my question is, what are the current obstacles, to requiring that businesses using algorithmic price setting disclose things at this particular level? Because it seems like, one would then be able to make an argument that, oh, well, we don't want to seem to undercut our own position, right?
Yes, so of course, most of the firms on the market are extremely afraid of revealing the fact that they personalize prices. And Delta Airline, I think this example became so notorious in the past months or weeks because Delta openly revealed this fact with shareholders, the public, and it created a immediate consumer roar. I would say there was a huge controversy on the media, in the policymaking. There was, as you said, this example clearly shows, and we have also similar examples from the past, that the consumer intuitive apprehension towards personalized pricing is so high that everybody or almost everybody who has access to data applies some elements of algorithmic pricing, or at least algorithmic assessment of the willingness to pay. But at the same time, nobody wants to talk about it openly. And your question, if I understand correctly, tackles precisely on how we can make firms reveal this information, yes? So of course, we can do it in a way that New York, the state of New York was trying to do so through legislation. It can be both the target legislation, it can be also the, I would say, indirect way of making firms accountable for the pricing schemes, for example, through antitrust and competition law enforcement. So certain data about pricing schemes can be revealed to the public, or can be revealed at least to the enforcement authorities through the disclosure mandated under competition law. And this New York legislation I was showing you on one of the previous slides, early October, it went through a control before a district court of New York, where some of the firms on the market were claiming that this is a compelled speech. Yeah. Yes, and the court said, no, it's not a compelled speech, it's a legitimate instrument of consumer protection. So I think with this example, also with this First Amendment precedent we have from 2 or 3 weeks ago, we can, I think, imagine a world in which there's more of this disclosure, and there's more of the disclosure that's more targeted to somehow pin down particular problems or particular elements of the personalizing pricing schemes that are particularly concerning regarding consumer interest and exploitation. Yes, please.
So thank you very much. Very interesting. If you consider consumers being the fat and happy version of citizens, and you apply the Jean Baudrillard definition, replace consumer with citizen instead, you have quite a scary future ahead, right? Because if the price then becomes influence, and you're using the data of your behavior to extract the interest and also to target you with messaging that might not be for all, but for you specifically to accelerate the level of influence, particularly for you, then you're still a consumer, but you're consuming power rather than t-shirts.
If you are consuming power through what? Sorry, can you repeat?
Power rather than t-shirts. And your currency is your vote rather than your wallet. So how would that legally kind of ring fence itself in order not to be utilized in a way that not manipulates the market, but rather manipulates democracy?
Also, if I understand your question correctly, you are asking about like this, and it's again, I assume you know this concept of consumer citizen and consumers who are also a part of like the particular polity. And your question is about like personalizing consumers to the extent that it can like influence the political choices they are making, yes, about certain values or rights on the market.
To protect the consumer.
Yes.
But if we are considering the consumer to be a citizen consuming power, how would that then influence the legal framework that need to be in place?
I wouldn't say it's necessarily consumers consuming power. I think it's because consumers are at the end of the day interested in like the direct consumption. Yes, they are interested in like buying particular goods or particular products, particular services. But the power can be manifested through those choices. Yes, think about, for example, the fair trade movement, yes, where consumers are interested in not only consuming, I don't know, a coffee, but they are interested in consuming coffee that comes from the particular sources, that was delivered through a particular distribution chain, that was manufactured with respect to, for example, particular fundamental rights, to particular ethical standards, and so far. So in this way, through our market choices, we can make the legitimate like political decisions, or we can reinforce particular political values. And we have many examples for that, also regarding like environmental protection, regarding like many other causes you can think about that can be translated onto like market consumer choices. I think with how it relates to personalized pricing, it's an excellent question. I can imagine that sophisticated algorithms can, for example, recognize that, I don't know, the particular consumer is more interested in buying, for example, fair trade products, and can price this consumer higher for those products, which eventually, of course, may have the political effect of either dissuading consumers from basically like following particular causes or like manifesting particular causes for their market choices, or can make it more economically expensive, more economically penniless for them. Yes, so we may have this correlation. Yes, please.
What extent is the problem the algorithm doing it as opposed to just dynamic pricing generally? So in certain sectors, like whether set by a human or an algorithm, I wouldn't want different prices for surgery for different people, or like vocational options and things like that. So I get this sort of we don't like algorithms type thing sometimes, and it can make mistakes and things like that. But what are there situations where in a given sector it's more problematic? I mean, it's okay if done by a human, but if done by an algorithm, it would be okay to have dynamic pricing?
I don't think it's only the question of algorithms, like algorithm versus human, like human versus machine. I think it's mostly about the intensity of surveillance and the intensity of insights into personal lives. So of course, as I said at the beginning, algorithmic pricing is not different in terms of substance. Yes, we have had for like centuries or like decades at least, multiple examples of prices that were differentiated for particular consumers vis-a-vis the other consumers, like medical services, education, also like simple like retail trade, like grocery shopping, like we have like the whole variety of techniques that were used to price particular consumers on a different basis than the other consumers. And everybody was more or less, I think, okay with that. What is problematic about algorithmic pricing is this element of knowledge, of the epistemic power about consumers that firms could gather, could generate through algorithms and through those very advanced surveillance techniques that are applied in the economy. So again, it's not the question of me paying a different price than a different consumer. It's primarily the problem of me losing the control over, first of all, what the firm knows about me and how this knowledge affects my economic, social, political, as we were talking before, standing. And also, to what extent this information is so intimate or so problematic that it should not be in like the well-functioning market the basis for price differentiation. For example, my race, my religion, my sexual orientation, and so far.
Boy, really insightful something. And could you go back to slide 17, your chart?
Yes.
Yeah, so I think going back to your title, and I really like argument. Strikes me that every cell except the cell which I like except reference price would be covered or would be covered under a certain interpretation of the GDPR, for example. And maybe it depends on how far you're taking the ex-ante prohibition, I guess. Maybe the reference price as well could be something that under regulation with stuff. So I wonder, so two parts to this question. First part is to what extent you see this as actually something that is maybe not primarily a question about privacy as you said it, but might be covered by at least what we now consider to be data privacy, data protection remedies. And the second question goes to the bottom row. So when we're talking about digital persona, I think if we abstract a little bit to privacy, problem we have, or like the mantra you hear about privacy is that for certain types of data processing, it will have a chilling effect on the behavior of citizens in general. And some privacy scholars are concerned with conformity, right? And for previous generations of US citizens, conformity was a major question. But it's also a question about who's driving that behavior, right? So if it's the government, then the government is driving behavior in a way that's not really legally authorized. Now, if we now talk about the market back again, still, I don't know if it's, so if you're saying that you would establish a prohibition on the basis of ethical, especially for ethical reasons, I'm not sure that would be enough for people to be satisfied that this power, the chilling effect that now the market has over behavior would be taken away. So I don't know if you would agree with that. Just if you would agree with it, but say, well, this is not a question. I'll go for my project.
So I'm not sure that, so regarding your first question, yes, certainly there is a big area of overlap between the digital persona, algorithmic pricing, and privacy. It's both GDPR, but also when you look into the particular, for example, state consumer privacy laws in the US, you have exactly or almost exactly the same conclusion you may derive from them, so that consumers should have the right to basically control the piece of information about them that is available to the business, to the firm. The question is, I think, primarily about how to make this possibility meaningful, because as you know, the all the consent autonomy-based solutions are not necessarily effective in terms of privacy control or privacy regulation. And we also have a pretty broad degree of situations in which consumers simply do not have enough information to even be able to object to the use of particular information by the firm. It becomes particularly problematic when this information, as regards personalized pricing, for example, has particular economic consequences. Yes, so where it's not only about the fact that we are getting particular advertisements on when we browse internet, but when it starts affecting the particular market position we have, the particular price we pay, our access to particular parts of social life, to particular commodities, and so far. And I think to this extent, this is a new element. This is slightly more intense than the classical consumer privacy discourses. Regarding your second question, if I understand correctly, you are asking about whether the prohibition of the particular of price personalization for particular types of commodities would not be too weak regarding the fact that there's much more of consumer interest involved in, for example, access to particular food products or medication. Is this
I think my question would be, does this capture everything you're concerned about market shape, our digital persona? Or is there more?
Oh, there's certainly more. No. So I was not claiming this as this bottom part of the table will solve all the problems. I'm only saying that apart from the digital persona problem, digital persona question, simply certain goods should not have the price that will be dependable on the particular consumer characteristics. Yes.
Thank you.
Yes, please.
Hey, yeah, thanks. This is a very interesting talk. So I guess I have two questions. So one is, I think one of the reasons that you mentioned that there was big consumer backlash when Delta announced that they were going to do algorithm pricing, I think one reason that there's this backlash is that consumers just understand that this is a huge windfall for companies that are able to do this, right? So, maybe it's true that there's nothing per se objectionable about the use of price discrimination, price personalization, but I think when you have technologies that allow this to be carried out at scale, it will amount to a huge, essentially, redistribution of, right? It's basically, if you have perfect price discrimination, then consumer surplus goes to zero, right? This is just a huge redistribution to companies, and I think that that's actually one reason why people are what's up with this, and I wonder how that kind of fits into your framework. And then my second question is, so to preface this by saying I'm not a privacy scholar, but so I find the idea of the digital persona that you put forward intuitively appealing and plausible. I think my question is, don't we need to sort of fill out the content of what someone is entitled to think falls within the digital persona? That is to say, the kinds of information that they should be able to have control over. Because it seems to me that otherwise it's just a formal model. So we don't know what exactly the types of information are that you should have control of it. And I think this is particularly crucial because it seems to me that the kinds of information that we're entitled to conceal from others depends a lot on the content. So, let's say in one place, I have a high entitlement that, my, religious beliefs or my sexual preferences, right? I should have an entitlement to like conceal this. But maybe like I less entitlement to conceal my sexual preferences from my sexual partner, or like maybe if I'm a religious community, I might have a less entitlement to conceal my, so I think like it's very context dependent. And so like the question would be in this sort of context of like the marketplace, what sorts of particular information do I have a legitimate expectation to be able to keep private?
Thanks. So both points are great. And I will explain why I think they are very relevant. So first of all, yes, I agree with you that the consumer backlash against algorithmic pricing as partly motivated by the factors you describe. I think it's also partly motivated by the fact that we have, and there's like the whole bunch of experimental, sociological, survey-based studies which all tell the same, that consumers who are asked about whether you would be happy with the price being personalized upon your personal data, upon like private details about you, extremely against that. And it's like a pattern across the world. It's not only about, for example, the US or Europe. And I think consumers we are intuitively tuned to think about consumer economy as the economy of equality, as the economy of equality in the sense that whenever I buy a can of soda in the morning, this can of soda will cost exactly the same or almost exactly the same in this store, in the other store, on this day or 2 days later. Yes. So I don't think so. So a part of the story is what you are saying. I think a part of the story is more like the intuitive kind of, even like socially subconscious perception of how the prices should be and what is the price fairness benchmark. And it's when you look into this from a more like theoretical perspective, it's much harder to understand where this benchmark is and why we should be. And this is something I was trying to explain at the beginning of my talk today, why we should be against price personalization, and that not necessarily, for example, all the prices that are differentiated or discriminatory, let's price particular consumer in different way than the other consumer, are something that we should be against from like the economic or from the perspective of legal fairness. I don't know if this answers your question, but I think you are right. I think, however, there's like much more to this picture, and this picture is not like only based on like consumer conviction that this is the way to somehow, give some pushback to particular pricing strategies of firms. Secondly, what you said about digital persona, I completely agree with this. So, and I think many of you are familiar with the concept of contextual integrity in privacy. This is more or less like in different words what you said. So the amount of information we should reveal or we can keep for ourselves depends heavily on the context. In the market context, I don't think we have the right to, or we should be able to keep all the details for ourselves. However, I also don't think that the details about ourselves should be commodified or should be put out there on the market, and that all the details about ourselves, for example, the details we would be pretty easy about revealing to our family members or to our, partner, are not necessarily the details we are always happy to reveal to somebody else for whom those details may be used as a basis to basically derive some economic consequences for us. So for example, we will not always be happy to have our private life determine the access we can have to the particular, electronic device, car, service on the market, only because the algorithm building on this data will personalize us in the particular way, will evaluate our willingness to pay in the particular way. So yes, and I cannot give like the definitive amount of information or like precise definition of what information should not be revealed. I think it also heavily depends on the context of particular commodities. So for example, insurance, we normally reveal much more about ourselves, about our health status, about our family status, about our very intimate details about ourselves than, for example, whenever we buy a book on the internet, yes? And in the algorithmic pricing world, the price for the book can be determined upon exactly the same set of facts that is used by the insurance company to determine our insurance premium. And this is, I think, like the benchmark between the information that should and should not be revealed lies somewhere like in between those two scenarios. Yes.
I'm wondering, in addition to the economic harm and the economic narrative of, no more plus just rationalize big firms taking what they can. You mentioned before there's also the epistemic harm of the individualization. Is there any dimension that you've identified in this phenomenon that would point to a moral harm or kind of like a malum, per se, where this is just wrong, this is just evil to do? Is there any dimension of that or any use case that you looked at that's like, we need to regulate this not for economic reasons, but for some kind of moral justification?
Yes, of course. So I think that clearly certain types of information should not be used to determine prices. Certain types of personal details, like for example, what we mentioned before, like information about our race, about our religion, about our let's say socially or personally sensitive aspects of our lives, should not be used in the ethically functioning economy to differentiate prices between people. Yes. So for example, people for whom the only important differentiating factor is the skin color should not be priced differently on this feature. Yes. So in short, this is the answer to your question. It also is a part of the digital persona question, because digital persona is not only about the information that we reveal and that the algorithms, for example, can use to analyze and to personalize us. It's also about the information that we want to keep for ourselves. Yes, that belong to our, let's say, non-digital life, and they should never go to the digital sphere, to the digital avatar at all, or at least should not be a part of the digital avatar that is used to personalize price for us.
So, except about this prohibition that you just mentioned, all the other measures that you're debating is not just some more elaborate reinforcement of the idea of informed consent in a context that sometimes people just don't have the option to opt out. I mean, just to give an example, imagine all that now everything that is in this ship, now it's reality. If I was a flight company, you would just raise the average market price in 20% and say, but if you opt for the dynamic price account, I'm going to offer you just now lower price for this next 3 flights.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, in Brazil, we have a situation where people would only be possible to have dynamic price based on your sensitive data if you have the explicit consent. So what people start saying, they start offering discounts if you consent and share your personal data. So maybe for some consumers, they will become a privilege where they can choose to be able to spend a little more and preserve their privacy. Those are the ones, the other part of the pyramid. It's really hard to think about the trade-off between privacy and immediately lower costs, even if you think that maybe in the long run it will become pricey for you.
Yes, absolutely. And it's a part of the story of personal data that's being commodified. In this context, it's somehow reversely commodified. Yes, so you can share your data in order to get a discount, yes, in order to pay less for another commodity, another service. It's exactly the same, for example, on the car insurance market in the US and in some other European countries where you can, for example, consent to have a specific like monitoring device installed in your vehicle and to pay a lower premium because the insurance company has access to like exact information about your driving patterns, about whether you overspeed, whether you drive recklessly or not. And let's say in exchange for this information, in exchange for like giving away your privacy, you're getting you're paying low for the insurance. Yeah, so in this sense, privacy, especially like if it's coupled with some kind of price personalization, can become a luxury, can become a privilege for particular social groups, but not for everybody. Yes. Yes, that's a great point.
So, quick question, to go back to what we were discussing with Mikey. I wonder if you have thought about the role of, and this is a very commercial law question for commercial lawyers, the role of intermediaries. Mikey, I think, was pushing you about non-marketed intermediaries, like maybe I'd be interested in consumer collectives, but someone in commercial law might think about that this might be, if well regulated, an opportunity for intermediaries like Google Flights allows us to navigate algorithmic pricing by now telling us you're paying higher than average, or prices are usually like this for people under your circumstances. So have you given any thought about intermediaries for this framework?
Intermediaries, you mean, if I understand?
Like through thinking about market actors or non-market actors.
Well, so there is, of course, like a lot of like intermediary stages between the consumer and the firm that provides particular commodity to this consumer. Yes, and it's of course like data brokers. It's of course all the, for example, booking websites, flight booking, but also it was an antitrust case a couple of years ago in Latin America. It was also involved Brazil. There was a booking website in Latin America that was providing consumers with the offers of hotels. And it was revealed like in the antitrust proceedings that this website was differentiating the offers that were displayed to consumers depending on whether the consumer was connecting to this website from the Apple device or from the Windows device. Because it was somehow like statistically proven by this website, by this platform, that consumers who use Apple devices may be interested in more, for example, more pricey or more sophisticated offers than the Windows device users. And so intermediaries, so this platform was not pricing consumers. This platform was simply deciding on what price or what type of offer you will get depending on the device you are using. Yes, so again, depending on some piece of personal information. Yes, so intermediaries are, of course, very important in this context.
Only 1 minute left. Thank you for this fascinating presentation. It's been great to have. Thank you so much.
Thank you, and thank you again for discussion.